That's the one. There we go.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. This is Klaus Sailors. This is Klaus in 60 Seconds live on Facebook, where we take about 15, 20 minutes to have conversations with really interesting folks. And I'm excited about today's guest. We've had a bunch of people talking about different sort of social justice issues and issues related to housing and so on. But of course, a big part of our roots are in the faith community. And Jill Duffield is the editor and publisher of Presbyterian Outlook. And we have her on because we're going to be talking a little bit about the dynamics of COVID and just sort of all the changes that are happening in the faith world. So I think the first place to start, so Jill and I actually met when she was the pastor of Shandon Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina. And she was very instrumental in getting the program up and running in Columbia, South Carolina, where ironically I'll be in a week and a half. But she then moved on to other things. So Jill, tell us a little bit about your journey and tell us a little bit about Presbyterian Outlook.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Presbyterian Outlook is an independent publication that covers the Presbyterian Church USA, and we equip pastors and faith leaders for ministry. We publish 18 times a year, and then we have a robust online platform website, and we're about to launch an app. So that's pretty exciting stuff for us. And we've pivoted with COVID too, along with everybody else. So we've pivoted some of our resources and emphasis and trying to equip folks as they're doing ministry in this very different context.
I love the idea of a Presbyterian app, but I guess it was meant to be.
It was meant to be.
That's right. It's an inside Calvinist joke. So, Jill, what would you say is sort of, you talked about the pivot with COVID. What do you think is the biggest change that COVID has had on the church world, kind of writ large?
Yeah, well, certainly many changes, but I think the use of technology, and that for some churches they were doing that, for some they were very reluctant. We had folks all in between, but it has forced churches to change and change rapidly, which sometimes, is sort of a joke that churches are the last and latest adapters, and often that's true. But in this case, churches have really had to lean in to technology and live streaming or recording worship, but not just worship, but reaching out to congregants and having virtual classes and staying connected, when a big part of what churches have valued has been face-to-face community. So that has been a big change. Small churches, large churches, rural, urban, everything in between.
Right, and if community is so built into the faith world. For Christianity, communion is a key sacrament, and that's the same root. And of course, every tradition has that, and we've seen that across the country because we have about 6,000 congregations or other kind of faith organizations involved with us in some way or other. It's obviously a critical part of our volunteer base, and kind of talking about that, for our perspective, the faith community, church, synagogue, mosque is both a place to worship, but it's also a center for outreach. So how do you see outreach changing? And do you think we'll ever get back to kind of some of the normal relationships between organizations like ours that work with congregations for the outreach? And what would that normal look like if we ever get back to it?
Yeah, I think one of the heartening things I've seen throughout this is that most congregations have doubled down in their commitment to outreach because they have seen the need. And of course, that need has grown with the economic repercussions of COVID. So churches that have traditionally, fed meals on a regular basis, they've continued to do that, and they've adapted how they do that, of course, for safety reasons, but they've really been committed to continuing to do it. And I've certainly seen that, and I'd love to hear you talk more about this too, but with Family Promise affiliates, I know the ones I know have done all manner of things in order to continue to house families and work with those families, even if it can't be within the fellowship hall or the Sunday school room. So I think in that sense, it's really hopeful and heartening to me that churches see these needs and feel deeply committed to responding to them. In terms of going back to something that was as it was, I'm not sure. I do think there will be an eagerness to have families back in the buildings. When can they do that safely? I don't know. I'm sure there will be a lot of thought around that. I think there was thought around that before, right? And necessarily so, but that this has upped our awareness and our attention to that. I hope that with this growing awareness of need, that there is an exponential outpouring of generosity, but also a commitment to public policy and working on those issues at a higher level so that there is a safety net for people, so that there is not this huge tsunami of need when we hit a crisis, because there are things in place to help folks on a regular basis. I think this has unmasked some of that, and I think there will be some congregations and faith communities who lean into that part of mission and outreach, and I look forward to seeing that unfold.
Jill, I think you're exactly right that we're seeing a lot of change. We're not going to see the same normal we had before. And it's interesting because on a national level for us, we've seen in some communities, there's a couple of communities that actually never stopped hosting families and congregations, remarkably enough. But most of them have, moving to hotels, moving to static sites, moving to temporary apartments, really leaning in on prevention and diversion work so that you keep families in their housing and so on. And, it's interesting. I mean, around us here in the Northeast, which is sort of the most, was the first hard hit area and has sort of, I think, some of the strongest challenges around it. Like, we have congregations, they're at best back at 25%, if they're even back to worship, no singing, no sign of peace, none of those sorts of things. So, and that's going to be for a long time. And I think all of those congregational leaders are kind of grappling with how do we make that pivot? How do we make that change? But I loved what you were saying about the fact that, of course, there's a great awareness, right? Every challenging situation has its negatives, but it causes people to realign and reassess and think about this. And I think the great awarenesses that have come is that, first of all, people understand how many families were so vulnerable. Because if it's not people that in their families themselves or people they know directly, it's still people that they know of, the waitress at the coffee shop.
Absolutely.
They're thinking about, they're suddenly realizing, wait a second, she's not just somebody that brings me coffee. She's the head of a household,
right.
No longer being able to earn an income. And I think also people recognize that housing is healthcare, is a right. You don't allow people not to have housing in the middle of a health emergency. It's terrible policy. So I think this opportunity for people to start thinking about some of the structural changes and the policy elements is really exciting. And I'm really glad to hear you saying that you think congregations are going to step into that space. Are there any other innovations that you think are going to come about? Like, right, in 5 years from now, what else is going to be different at congregations as a result of the COVID crisis, which I think probably just amplified or accelerated some of the changes that were going to happen anyway?
Right. I agree with that. I think certainly on the technology front, that definitely has just accelerated things that probably would need to happen. I think that there will be some scarcity of resources, or maybe even a perception of that, and sometimes a reality of that, as people have been hit economically, and that will continue to impact us for quite a while. So I think that will cause churches and other institutions to try and really align their values and mission with their resources. They have to reassess when you have to make hard choices. So I think that will happen. I do think that the church will be a hybrid from here on out in terms of in-person events and also virtual events. And I also think that for a long time, the church has resisted, we worship at this time, and we have Sunday school at this time, and we have Wednesday night Bible study. And if you want to be part of that, then you come to those things. Whereas the rest of the world was, you access it when you want to access it. You watch your movie when you want to watch it. You go to the gym when you want to go to the gym. And I think the church has really resisted that. But now folks can access worship whenever they want. They can listen to it as they walk the dog. Bible studies happen at all manner of different times. And I think that that's going to continue. And I think that is not a bad thing. I think we have to value equally however people access the mission and the work of the church, and not have sort of a sense of this is less than. I heard someone say that, yes, there are things we can do in person that we cannot do virtually, but there are things we can do virtually that we cannot do in person. And so let's recognize the value of both of those mediums and use them to the best of our capacity for good.
That's true, right? If you were still the pastor in Shandon Presbyterian in Columbia, I was not going to be able on a Sunday to go to your services, being here in New Jersey. But virtually I can, right? And and other kinds of groups. And so I think that is a real opportunity. And that segues to another question related to that I want to ask, because anybody who's working with the faith community and anybody in the faith community is grappling with the question of, we've seen a continuous decline in religiosity among younger Americans.
Right. Yeah.
They go to services, whatever their faith tradition is, much less than they used to. Even if they are interested in being part of a congregation, 10 o'clock, hymns from the 19th century, stories about 2,000-year-old people in Palestine, maybe not always the most resonant for them. So what do you see being the future for congregations? What do congregations need to do to bring in some of those younger people and kind of create that next generation that they need to be able to sustain themselves?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some fascinating research coming out of a group called Sacred Design, and some of their early research showed that this was with millennials, but now even younger. It wasn't that they weren't going to church because they weren't interested in things like spirituality, God, purpose, all of these kind of big life questions that we grapple with in the faith community. But there was a sense that it wasn't somehow relevant to them, right? And so they sometimes created their own communities, and they did that with Soul Cycle or CrossFit or various and other things that provide community and meaning and accountability and purpose. And I think as the church, we need to look at that and go, well, if these are some of the things that folks are seeking, why is it that they're either A, not seeking them here, or B, not finding them here? And to have a real honest assessment of that for ourselves. I'm a church insider, right? So when I go in a church building, I feel at home, or even another faith community, another faith tradition. Some of that language feels familiar and wonderful to me. I have to remember that for some, it's really intimidating to go into that space, and that a lot of that language is not familiar. A lot of those rituals aren't familiar. So how do we remember that and then communicate in a different way? And frankly, go to where people are, rather than having the expectation that, if you build it or if it's here, they will come. So creating all kinds of different on-ramps. And I do think the use of technology is a big part of that. And so we've gotten a jump start on that, right? So there's a guy on Instagram who's an Anglican priest from England. He has more followers than the Church of England Instagram, and he does 30-second sermons for seekers. So how do we leverage some of those tools that are make it invitational for folks?
I love that. It makes so much sense. I think there's actually a saying in the Jewish tradition from Hillel, right, where he was approached and basically said, "Can you tell me everything I need to know while I'm standing on one foot?" And I think other rabbis said, "Oh, that's preposterous," and so on. And then Hillel said, "No, I can do that," right, because he was meeting that person where he was.
Where they are, right.
And a 30-second sermon, probably has a lot more impact than a lot of 20-minute sermons have had. And I think another thing too, so you talk about technology, you talk about sort of this fluidity and flexibility to draw in younger people. I also think being engaged in outreach is such a critical component, because
huge.
I have to say, like, my kids, who are, how old are they? 21 to 26, something like that.
I have some in that range too. Yep.
They have birthdays and I can't keep track of their ages, but they're not congregation attenders, but they're incredibly social justice oriented and incredibly action oriented. They want to be doing things. And so I think congregations, they have to, like you said, they have to embrace technology. They have to embrace fluidity. They have to meet people where they are. They have to lose hold of some of these received knowledges of what service is, church service is, and recognize that service to the community is what really matters to so many people. So, the last question I'll ask you, Jill, is what is your advice that the people who watch this, a lot of them are connected to congregations, they're at affiliates and so on. What's your advice in general around the current COVID times and the future for people who are in leadership in congregations?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a season of discernment and listening, listening to voices that are not part of our general spheres. Sometimes, we do sort of get in echo chambers. I think for us to intentionally seek the voices of those with whom we might not hear if we don't seek them out, to know what their life is like, how they have been impacted by this in ways that perhaps some of us have not. So I think it's going to be a season of listening. I think it's going to be a season of failing forward. We're going to have to try things and be flexible, not always the adjectives applied to the church or faith communities. We're going to have to let go of things that we may have treasured for a long time in order to free up energy to do new things. And I do think there is going to be a sense of improvisation in some ways, right? We're going to have to learn by doing, and we're going to make some mistakes, and that's okay. Certainly in the area of social justice, we're going to make some mistakes, but we need to make those mistakes. We need to be making the effort. And so I think if we can practice some humility, and I also feel like a sense of joy in a season where sometimes that's hard to find, and yet there is great joy to be had in working together with some folks who are deeply passionate about making the world a better place, and they may have a different belief system, but if we can come together on shared values, I think we can have a huge impact in the communities in which we live.
Well, to that I would say amen.
That was very churchy.
Jill, thank you very much. I really appreciate your insights and your thoughts. It's such a, for anybody who's involved in the faith community, it is this real time of change, and we know there's lots of congregations that are considering what their future is and if they even have a future right now. And I think exactly the way you said to approach it is how we have to approach it, and also recognize that the faith world, like every other world, is constantly fluid and constantly reinventing itself, and exploring new things, as you said, making mistakes, but charting new ground and being relevant in new ways, at the same time that leaning in on obviously the core elements. So thank you also very much for all your work in helping get our affiliate in Columbia started, which is an awesome program, and your work at the Presbyterian Outlook. I will say have a fantastic weekend. Thanks for coming on, and to everybody out there, have a great weekend.
Thanks, Klaus. Good to be with you. Thank you.